What if I told you that in the Middle Ages, death wasn't just a punishment, it was a performance? Imagine standing in a crowded square, the air thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and roasting meat from street vendors, while the townsfolk gathered not for a fair or a feast, but to watch a man die. Public executions weren't just about justice. They were spectacles, they were theater, and they were meant to terrify you into obedience. The condemned were paraded through the streets, their crimes shouted aloud, their bodies often already broken by torture. And then, in front of hundreds or even thousands, they were killed in ways designed not just to end the life, but to carve terror into the minds of everyone watching. Some were hanged, some were burned, some were mutilated beyond recognition. But no matter the method, one truth was clear. In medieval Europe, your death could become entertainment. And that's what we're exploring today. The horrific truth about medieval public executions. Before we dive in, if you're fascinated by the darker side of history, the strange, the brutal, the shocking stories they teach in school, make sure you subscribe to our channel and leave a like. It helps us uncover even more of the past's most disturbing secrets. Now, let's step into the execution ground, where death was slow, justice was brutal, and the crowd always wanted more. Picture the square before sunrise. Frost clings to the cart ruts, breath fogs the air, and a wooden platform creaks as men tighten pegs and test the trapdoor with their boots. The bell that usually calls people to prayer tolls a different rhythm today, a summons that makes shutters crack open along the lane. Not a fair, not a market, something darker that everyone understands without saying. By the time the sun lifts, the scaffold stands like a stage set, ropes freshly tarred, sawdust scattered to drink what must be spilled. Crowds arrive by habit more than curiosity. Bakers bring loaves, still warm. A brewer rolls a barrel. Mothers straighten caps. Fathers hoist children to shoulders they shouldn't yet need to carry such sight. Priests arrive in pairs, lips moving, eyes fixed. A magistrate in black fur steps onto the platform and tests the boards with a heel. The executioner is already there, anonymous and ordinary, wiping an axe head with oiled cloth or flexing gloved hands around a length of hemp. No fanfare, just competence, and the quiet knowledge of what comes next. Procession first. The condemned do not come alone. They are brought from the jail at the edge of town along a route everyone knows, flanked by guards in dented breastplates. A clerk walks ahead, reading the sentence in a voice sanded flat by repetition. Sometimes there is a rough wooden cross strapped to the prisoner's back. Sometimes a placard hangs at the neck, inked with a single word: thief, heretic, traitor, so that no one can pretend they did not understand. Heads are shaved, feet bare, garments cut to humility. The humiliation begins long before the rope. That walk is a test, and everyone knows it. The condemned can rage, can plead, can curse, can bargain, yet the crowd leans in for something else. The last speech, a good death in a cruel world, still matters. To confess aloud, to ask forgiveness, to warn others not to follow, these are the small coins left to spend. Sometimes the words are steady and the square falls silent, and sometimes there is defiance. A shouted claim of innocence that sets murmurs running through the throng like wind through barley. Money moves quietly. A relative palms a few coins to a turnkey. A friend nods toward the platform where the headsman waits. Everyone understands what this buys: not freedom, never that, but competence. About blades that bite and stop, about the third swing that finally finds the spine, while the crowd groans as one organism. No one wants those stories to be about this morning. Even the ordinary methods are not ordinary when performed in public. Hanging with a short drop does not break the neck. Sometimes the officers shove them back and let the spectacle run its course. Beheading promises speed, but resents haste. An axe demands stillness, a sword demands skill. And both demand that the condemned hold their courage at the exact moment courage is hardest to hold. Rituals bloom around the brutality like wildflowers in a ditch. A cup of spiced wine offered to steady the hands that will soon be bound. A blindfold asked for and refused, or refused and insisted upon. A prayer begun too soon, interrupted by the clack of a wedge. A prayer begun too late, snatched by the trapdoor. Vendors hawk pies to those who cannot look away long enough to eat them. Children repeat a rhyme whose edges adults pretend not to hear. When the moment comes, it always comes too quickly and far too slow. Then the lesson. Bodies are not merely removed, they are displayed. A head lifted by its hair so the square can learn the face of ruin. A limb nailed to a gate. A rope left hanging for days to whisper to anyone who passes beneath. Punishment leaks into the streets on purpose, into doorways and dreams. The authorities understand memory better than most. If pain ends on the scaffold, the lesson ends with it. If remnants remain wood, iron, stain the lesson, returns every morning with the bread. Not every execution is grand. Sometimes the condemned is strapped to a stool and branded, ear nailed for an hour to the town post, and then clipped away with a knife. That does not bother with delicacy. Sometimes a tongue is shorn for blasphemy, the wet syllables of speech punished by taking speech itself. These are not capital sentences, but they belong to the same theater. The body is parchment, upon which the law writes in hot iron. Those who watch leave marked as well, though the skin they carry their mark on is inside the skull. There are moments of unexpected tenderness. A jailer loosens a shackle so the last walk won't scrape bone. A priest stands close enough to be heard over the murmur and does not flinch when spittle flecks his sleeve. An executioner whispers where to place the chin, how to breathe, when to speak, if speaking is wanted. In these small instructions lives a human knowledge older than codes and courts. If death cannot be refused, it can at least be ordered, shaped into something that looks, from one angle, like dignity. And yet the square is never innocent. People will argue for years afterward about what they saw. Did the condemned die bravely? Did the blade flash clean? Was justice served, or only power? The answers change depending on who is asked and when. By nightfall, the platform boards are stacked beside a wall, the sawdust is raked thin, and the square becomes a market again. But the town carries the morning with it, the bell's wrong rhythm, the hush before the trap fell, the way the crowd exhaled as if one throat had been opened and the breath let out. Public executions promised certainty in a world that rarely offered it. They said, "Here's the line, cross it, and we will show you exactly what waits." That promise was a comfort to some and a terror to others, and most people stood somewhere in between. Drawn to the scaffold as to a mirror that shows too much, the Middle Ages knew how to make law visible. It looked like a platform, a rope, a blade. It sounded like wood complaining under weight and steel, answering its calling. And it smelled always of smoke, sweat, and the metallic sweetness the wind carries away last. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder there in the heaving press of a medieval town square. The air is sharp with the odor of livestock and wood smoke, but beneath it, all fainter, sour, and unforgettable is the smell of fear. Not your own, though that creeps in as you wait, but the fear of the person who soon will mount the scaffold. You hear the restless shifting of boots on frozen ground, the mutters of men wagering on whether the executioner will strike true, and the soft whimper of a child clinging to her mother's skirts. This is no private punishment. It is theater, and the actors are about to step on stage. The condemned appears, and the crowd surges forward like a living wave. Perhaps it is a thief, thin from weeks in a dungeon cell, or a heretic, whose eyes still blaze with conviction, even as ropes chafed raw around their wrists. Or a woman accused of witchcraft, hair hacked short, shivering in a thin shift while townsfolk hiss the word sorceress. Whoever they are, they become something larger than themselves in this moment. They are no longer a neighbor, nor even a criminal. They are a warning made flesh. Their bodies soon to be transformed into an example carved directly into the memory of everyone watching. Executioners understood this better than anyone. Their job was not just to kill it, was to perform. Every gesture mattered. The deliberate sharpening of the blade before the crowd, the slow testing of the rope, the measured steps across the platform. They cultivated an aura of ritual and inevitability, as if to say, the law is not a suggestion, and this is what happens when you defy it. At times, the executioner was hated, even cursed. But just as often, they were strangely respected, sought after for their skill in ensuring a merciful death. A botched beheading could stir outrage. A clean one could bring relief, even admiration. And here lies one of the strangest contradictions of these spectacles. Cruelty and mercy walked hand in hand. Families of the condemned sometimes bribed the headsman quietly to guarantee a swift end. A little silver, a whispered promise, and the axe would fall true. Failures lived on in infamy. Consider the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. In 1587, though later than the medieval age, it carried echoes of it. The first blow struck her head but did not sever it. The second left sinew clinging. Only the third strike completed the act, and witnesses spoke of the horror in the room. In an earlier era, such botched moments played out before entire towns, feeding gossip for decades. Hanging, too, was often anything but swift. In the Middle Ages, the short drop was most common. The rope tightened, but the neck did not break. The condemned kicked and twisted, their face darkening, tongue swelling grotesquely until life ebbed away. Sometimes relatives or even strangers rushed forward to pull at the dangling legs, hastening the end. At other times, the authorities forced them back, determined that justice should be drawn out for all to see. The spectacle could last minutes that felt like hours. Each gasp and convulsion seared into the memory of every child who peeked through the crowd. Burning at the stake was perhaps the most dreaded of all. Fire was seen as purification, a way to cleanse the soul through agony. Heretics, witches, and traitors often faced this fate. Wood was stacked high, sometimes deliberately dampened, so the smoke would smother slowly rather than swiftly. Eyewitnesses described faces contorted beyond recognition, voices shrieking prayers until flame swallowed them. In rare acts of mercy, friends of the condemned slipped gunpowder bags around the neck or strangled them quietly before the fire took hold. Yet more often, the blaze was allowed to consume, feeding the lesson into the eyes of every onlooker. This is what defiance costs. The breaking wheel, or Catherine wheel, offered yet another spectacle of horror. Stripped and bound, the victim's limbs were shattered with iron bars, bones splintering under blows designed to prolong, not hasten, death. The mangled body was then woven into the spokes of a massive wheel and left to die under the sun, sometimes for days. Crows and dogs finished what the executioner began. Few punishments more vividly displayed the medieval obsession with turning justice into public memory. Every passerby saw the corpse splayed above them, a grotesque emblem of law written in flesh. But perhaps the cruelest part of all was how ordinary people absorbed these spectacles. Children were present, sitting on shoulders. Merchants set up stalls, selling pies, beer, and trinkets. For some, it was entertainment. For others, a spiritual lesson. Priests preached about sin and salvation, while the condemned writhed before their flock. Parents told sons and daughters, "Remember this day, step out of line, and this could be you." And so the violence soaked into the culture itself, handed down like folklore, normalized as part of civic life. Yet beneath the noise, there was silence to moments when even the rowdiest crowds hushed, the hush before the axe fell, the intake of breath when fire caught, the stillness as the last twitch of life passed into death. These silences were not empty, they were heavy, filled with the realization that while today someone else stood on the scaffold, tomorrow it could be anyone. Medieval justice was not blind. It stared with unblinking eyes, and those eyes looked back at the crowd as much as at the condemned. Public executions were not simply punishments, and in that strange mixture of cruelty and ceremony, they revealed the deepest truths of the Middle Ages. That death was not private, not sacred, not hidden away, but staged, displayed, and remembered. Imagine the scene again. The scaffold has been built, the crowd has gathered, and the condemned prisoner kneels, awaiting the inevitable. But before the blade falls, or the rope tightens, another figure steps forward, hooded, cloaked, or sometimes brazenly unmasked. This was the executioner, one of the most paradoxical figures in medieval society. To understand public executions, you cannot ignore the executioner, because he wasn't just a tool of justice. He was the very hand that transformed law into death, and in many ways, the executioner himself carried almost as much weight, terror, and stigma as the punishments he carried out. The stigma of blood? Executioners lived in a strange twilight world. They were absolutely essential. Every city, every principality needed someone to carry out sentences of death, mutilation, or torture. Yet, at the same time, these men were treated like outcasts. In many parts of Europe, executioners were considered unclean, almost untouchable. Neighbors would not sit with them at church. Families often refused to allow their daughters to marry into their bloodline. Children of executioners could be bullied, denied guild memberships, or shunned from the marketplace. And yet, when the moment of death came, everyone looked to them. The law demanded punishment, and only the executioner could deliver it. In this way, he was both reviled and respected. the necessary evil standing at the edge of society. The mask and the hood. When you picture a medieval executioner, you might imagine the black hood, the faceless figure swinging an axe, his identity hidden from view. While this image is partly a later invention from theater and literature, it does have some truth. In smaller towns, executioners often worked barefaced because everyone knew who they were anyway. But in larger cities, or in especially sensitive cases, where powerful nobles or heretics were being executed, disguises helped protect the executioner from revenge. After all, killing a common thief was one thing, killing a lord, or a beloved figure accused of heresy. That could make you the target of an angry mob. The hood gave them anonymity, but also added to the aura of dread. It transformed the executioner into something more than a man, into death itself, walking among the crowd. A life surrounded by death. Executioners didn't just carry out death sentences. In many cities, their responsibilities included torture, interrogation, and even mutilations like cutting off hands or branding criminals. They also often served as cleaners of sorts, disposing of corpses, animals, or plague victims when others refused. The irony is that executioners often became experts in the human body. Some were skilled at cutting throats cleanly, severing heads in one stroke, or even setting broken bones when their duties required torture without death. In some towns, executioners doubled as unlicensed surgeons or healers because their knowledge of anatomy made them strangely valuable. Yet this dual role only deepened the contradiction. A man who killed by day and healed by night. The executioner's dilemma, one of the most dangerous parts of the job, wasn't swinging the axe. It was failing. In an age when death was supposed to be swift and decisive, a botched execution could turn an already horrific event into chaos. A headsman who missed his mark and struck a prisoner's shoulder or jaw instead of their neck risked more than humiliation. The crowd could turn violent, furious at his incompetence. Authorities might punish him severely for failing in his duties. Some executioners were even forced to finish the job with desperate, repeated blows, hacking at their victim in plain sight, while the audience screamed. But there was a flip side. If an executioner performed his duty well, one clean stroke, one perfect act, he might receive praise, applause, or even payment from grateful families who wanted their loved ones to die quickly and with dignity. This strange blend of fear and admiration meant that an executioner could walk through the marketplace despised. But on the scaffold itself, he held immense power. The executioner as performer, and make no mistake, executions weren't just punishments, they were performances. The executioner wasn't just a killer, he was a grim kind of actor. He had to control the moment. He had to manage the condemned, the crowd, and the spectacle of justice itself. His timing, his precision, and even his words mattered. Sometimes, executioners taunted the condemned. Other times, they showed mercy by helping them die quickly. Their every move was watched, judged, and remembered. And in this way, the executioner became part of the theater of power. The man who transformed royal commands into bloody reality before thousands of eyes. Executioners were ghosts who lived among the living. Necessary but hated, despised yet indispensable. They remind us that medieval justice was not just about laws written on parchment, but about flesh, blood, and the men who turned judgment into finality. The medieval world was not just about crime and punishment, it was also about power. Who had it, who wanted it, and how far they were willing to go to keep it. And nowhere was that power displayed more brutally than in the public execution of political enemies and religious dissenters. When a thief was hanged, the people saw justice. But when a traitor or heretic was burned, broken, or beheaded, they were witnessing something far more sinister. A performance of control, a warning written in blood and fire. Kings, queens, bishops, and popes understood that death was more than the end of life. It was a symbol, a weapon. The execution of one person could strike fear into thousands. And so, the scaffold became a stage, not only for justice, but for propaganda. Imagine being in the crowd at the execution of a traitor. You hear the trumpets blare. Soldiers march the condemned man forward, chains rattling with every step. He may be gagged, or perhaps allowed to speak, giving a final plea or a curse upon his enemies. His body is broken not simply to kill him, but to remind the entire crowd. This is what happens when you dare to defy the crown. Some of the most gruesome punishments were reserved for treason. To betray one's king or queen was considered worse than murder. It was an attack on the very soul of the kingdom. That's why traitors in England, for example, were often sentenced to the horrific punishment of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. The condemned man would be dragged through the streets, hanged until near death, cut open while still alive, and finally dismembered. His body parts were then displayed on city gates as grisly warnings to others. It wasn't only an execution, it was a message carved into flesh and bone. Religion, too, played a dark role in these executions. The medieval church held immense power, and it wielded death as one of its sharpest tools. Heretics, those who questioned doctrine, refused to follow orthodoxy, or preached forbidden beliefs, were often handed over to secular authorities with the chilling phrase, "Relax them to the secular arm." What that meant was simple: burn them. The pyre became the church's stage. Flames roared as men and women were bound to stakes, their voices silenced under the crackle of wood and smoke. To the crowd, this wasn't only about punishing a heretic, it was about proving the strength of faith, about purging evil from the world in a spectacle of fire. And the church ensured that everyone was there to see it. Consider Joan of Arc, though she would later be canonized as a saint. At the time of her execution, she was condemned as a heretic. In 1431, the young French woman who had led armies and inspired her people was tied to a stake in Rouen. Before thousands of onlookers, flames consumed her body. For the authorities who ordered it, her death was meant to erase her influence, to humiliate her, to prove the church's dominance. Yet ironically, it had the opposite effect. It turned her into a martyr, a symbol of resistance, and eventually, a saint. This was the strange paradox of political and religious executions. They were meant to silence, to terrify, to end rebellion before it began, and often they succeeded. But sometimes, death only amplified the voice of the condemned, echoing louder in death than in life. For rulers, this was a dangerous gamble. The scaffold was a stage, but it was also unpredictable. A condemned heretic who faced the flames with courage could inspire sympathy from the crowd. A nobleman who died with dignity could become a legend, and sometimes, instead of destroying a name, an execution immortalized it. Public executions of political and religious figures were not only about death, they were about control, about showing the people that no one, no matter how noble or holy, was above the law, the crown, or the church. Yet the blood spilled on those stages often told a more complicated story, one that rulers could not always control. When most people today think of execution, they imagine a swift end, a single blow, a drop from the gallows, or a clean shot. But in the Middle Ages, death was rarely clean. Often it was slow, deliberate, and designed to drag on for as long as possible. Because for medieval rulers, death wasn't just about removing an enemy. It was about sending a message. And the longer the agony, the stronger the lesson. Torture before execution was a way to make that message unforgettable. Instead of a quick beheading, condemned men and women might first be mutilated, branded, flogged, or torn apart in front of the crowd. Pain was theater, and the audience came to watch it unfold. One of the most infamous punishments was the breaking wheel. The condemned was tied to a large wooden wheel, arms and legs spread wide. Then, with deliberate precision, the executioner would smash their limbs with an iron bar or hammer. Bones shattered, joints splintered, and screams echoed across the square. But the execution didn't end there. After their body was broken, the criminal was often left on display, their mangled form tied to the wheel until death finally came. Sometimes hours, sometimes days later, the breaking wheel was not just execution, it was slow annihilation, and the crowd witnessed every moment. Then there was impalement, perhaps one of the cruelest methods ever devised. A sharp wooden stake was forced through the body, sometimes carefully positioned to avoid vital organs so the victim lingered in torment. The stake was then raised upright, and the dying person left to writhe in the air. This punishment was so feared that it became legendary, associated especially with Vlad the Impaler in the 15th century, but the practice was far older, a reminder that medieval rulers understood the terrifying power of pain. Burning alive was another form of execution that doubled as torture. To be bound at the stake, surrounded by faggots of wood, and set alight was one of the most dreaded fates. Sometimes executioners tried to make the process merciful by hanging pouches of gunpowder around the victim's neck. which would explode and hasten death. Other times, the flames were deliberately kept low, ensuring the condemned burned slowly from the feet upward. Imagine the horror of watching your own flesh char while smoke filled your lungs, unable to move, while thousands of eyes bore into you. This was more than execution. It was ritualized terror. There were also punishments designed to humiliate before death. A condemned thief might have his ears cut off or his tongue removed before hanging. A traitor could be castrated or disemboweled before the final blow. In these cases, mutilation was not just cruelty, it was a warning. The body became a living message of dishonor, stripped of dignity, displayed for all to see. The audience, of course, played a vital role in these tortures. Their gasps, their cries, their cheers gave energy to the spectacle. In some places, children were even brought to watch, told that this was the price of disobedience. Pain became a lesson, and execution day was a grim form of public schooling. Yet, amid all this brutality, there was also an odd sense of ritual. Torture and execution often followed strict procedures, overseen by laws and customs. The executioner's blows had to be delivered in a certain order. The condemned might be allowed final words, confessions, or prayers. And the crowd, while entertained, also treated the spectacle as a moral drama. The triumph of justice over sin, order over chaos, the living over the condemned. But make no mistake, these were not quick deaths. They were carefully drawn-out performances, each strike and scream designed to leave an impression that lingered long after the body was gone. For the rulers of medieval Europe, the scaffold wasn't just a place of death. It was a stage of control, and pain was the most powerful actor. To us today, the idea of gathering in a town square to watch someone burned, hanged, or torn apart feels barbaric. Yet, in the Middle Ages, executions were not private affairs. They were public rituals, staged with care, designed not only to punish the guilty, but also to reassure and entertain the living. In fact, the presence of the crowd was just as important as the execution itself. Without witnesses, the punishment would lose its power. On execution day, towns and villages came alive. Bells rang to summon people. Merchants set up stalls to sell bread, pies, wine, and ale to the gathering masses. Children darted about in excitement, while old men claimed their usual spots near the scaffold. Families arrived early to secure a good view, as though preparing for a festival. In a sense, that's exactly what it was. A festival of justice. A grim carnival where death was the main attraction. The crowd wasn't there only for entertainment. They were part of the moral performance. Watching someone punished for theft, heresy, adultery, or treason reinforced the rules everyone else lived under. Each burning, hanging, or beheading was a reminder. This could be you if you strayed from the path. People whispered among themselves, pointing at the condemned, weighing whether the punishment matched the crime. Gossip ran wild. Stories spread quickly, growing more sensational with each retelling, making the example even stronger than the spectacle itself. But it would be a mistake to think the crowd was always grim or fearful. Many came for thrills. A hanging promised drama. Would the rope snap? Would the condemned struggle? A burning promised horror. Would the flames rise quickly, or would the victim's screams echo through the smoke? People jeered, laughed, or even mocked the dying. Some threw rotten vegetables or mud at those tied to the stake. Others, in more solemn moods, prayed aloud for the condemned soul, tears streaming as they begged God to show mercy. It was a strange mixture of cruelty and compassion, amusement and piety, all colliding in one place. The executioner knew the crowd's mood mattered. A skilled executioner could turn a death into a well-paced performance. A botched beheading, for instance, where the first swing failed to sever the head, could turn the crowd furious. They expected precision, a clean strike, a satisfying finale. In fact, executioners who consistently failed their duty sometimes faced lynching themselves. The audience wasn't just passive, they were critics, quick to judge whether the show was worth their time. Yet the strangest part of all was how normalized it became. Parents took their children to watch executions, as if it were part of their education. Religious leaders encouraged attendance, insisting that witnessing justice served would strengthen faith. And so, children grew up accustomed to death as spectacle, learning early on that the law was not just written in words, but in blood. At times, crowds even demanded harsher punishments. If an execution seemed too merciful, people shouted for more. They wanted suffering, not mercy, because only suffering could prove justice was done. Other times, though, they turned against the authorities. If the condemned was popular, perhaps a charismatic preacher, a beloved outlaw, or even a wrongly accused villager, the crowd might erupt in anger, throwing stones at guards or trying to save the victim. Executions were supposed to bring order, but sometimes they unleashed chaos. And yet, despite the horror, there was always a sense of excitement. People talked about executions for weeks afterward. Ballads were written, tales were told, and entire communities bonded over the memory of what they had seen. It was a shared experience, as important to medieval life as festivals, markets, or church processions. To live in the Middle Ages was to live with death constantly on display, and public execution was the most vivid reminder of all. For medieval rulers, this was the ultimate purpose. Death wasn't hidden away in prisons or quiet corners. It was paraded in the open, staged for everyone to witness. Justice had to be seen to be believed, and the crowd was both witness and participant. Each gasp, each cheer, each prayer reinforced the authority of the state and the church. And so, in the medieval imagination, public execution was never just about killing. It was about showing. It was about teaching. And above all, it was about reminding every man, woman, and child that life was fragile, power was absolute, and death was never far away. If there is one truth that emerges from the medieval world of public executions, it is that death was never private, it was never silent, and it was never simple. It was theater, crafted with intent, staged for meaning, and remembered long after the ashes cooled or the gallows stood empty. For the rulers of the Middle Ages, kings, queens, bishops, lords, execution was a tool as sharp as any sword. It wasn't just about removing criminals, heretics, or rebels from the world. It was about showing everyone else what happened when you dared to defy authority. A hanged thief was a warning to other thieves. A burned heretic was a sermon made flesh. A disemboweled traitor was a message that loyalty was not optional, but mandatory. The power of these acts lay in their visibility. In a world without newspapers, without television, without social media, the execution was the headline event. It was the broadcast, the spectacle, the story that spread from village to village and remained alive in memory for generations. Ordinary people might never meet their king face to face, but they could not escape the sight of his justice. The scaffold was the throne's shadow, falling across every marketplace and square. But executions were more than fear. They were rituals of belief. The church declared them necessary for the salvation of society. Watching a sinner die in agony was not just justice, it was purification. The crowd was not only entertained, they were reminded of heaven and hell, of the price of sin, of the mercy they must seek in confession. For the faithful, the condemned screams were not just noise, they were warnings from God, escort itself. Yet beneath this cloak of religion and law, there was something darker, fascination. Human beings, then, as now, were drawn to death. They wanted to see the line between life and nothingness. They wanted to hear the final words of a man who had stolen, or betrayed, or killed. They wanted to see if he would beg, curse, or remain silent. They wanted to measure their own courage against his, and so execution became a mirror. The condemned stood before the crowd as a kind of distorted reflection. Not just a criminal, but a human soul stripped bare before eternity. Execution also gave voice to those who had none. The victim's death often carried a message. Some died cursing their rulers, their words echoing like defiance even as the axe fell. Others forgave their executioners, turning the spectacle into a sermon of mercy. There were even those who laughed, who joked, who walked to their fate with heads held high, denying the authorities the satisfaction of fear. In these moments, the condemned stole the stage, and the power of death shifted, if only for an instant, from the rulers to the ruled. Still, the weight of execution pressed hardest on the ordinary people who watched. For a child standing in the square, the image of a burning body or a swinging corpse could never be forgotten. For a mother, seeing a neighbor hanged might bring fear for her own children. For a young man, watching a traitor disemboweled was a brutal lesson in loyalty. Death seeped into memory, shaping lives, bending choices, molding an entire culture around the certainty that punishment was not hidden but displayed. And so public execution did not just enforce law, it sculpted society. It created a world where violence was ordinary, where justice was inseparable from pain, where mercy was rare, and where authority declared itself not through quiet command, but through bloody demonstration. To live in the Middle Ages was to know that the edge of the sword, the crack of the whip, the roar of the crowd, and the shadow of the scaffold were never far away. What remains chilling is not only how common these executions were, but how eagerly people accepted them. They weren't simply tolerated, they were expected. They were part of the rhythm of life, part of the order of things, a dance between crime and punishment where death always led. To us, it feels grotesque. To them, it was reality. And yet, perhaps the most haunting thought of all is that these public deaths did not vanish entirely with the Middle Ages. Even today, we live in a world where violence is broadcast, where punishment is performed, where the suffering of others becomes spectacle. We may no longer gather in the town square, but the fascination remains. The echoes of medieval scaffolds still reach us, reminding us that the line between justice and cruelty, between order and brutality, has always been thin. So the next time you hear the phrase public execution, don't think only of history's past. Think of it as a mirror, one that reflects not only the medieval world, but the darker parts of our own.